Oh, hello. Caught me dealing with a particularly thorny zugzwang. Welcome, in any case. I'm Brian McKenzie, and this is another lecture from Critical Skills. This lecture will be very short and talk about strategies used in writing. Specifically, we're going to look at quotes, paraphrases, summaries, and how to create a research space, or they say, I say. So these are all very practical things that you will do in the process of writing. This will be, I promise, a short lecture because there's plenty of material already available on the course about these different strategies used in writing. So what I'm going to talk about in this lecture are a few things that I want to really emphasize that may be present in some of the resources, readings, and other videos, but that are not emphasized as much as I would prefer. So that's what we're going to talk about over the next few minutes. Okay, let's talk about direct quotes for a bit. So, when do you use a direct quote? This is a question that students often ask. The primary answer there, or the sort of essence of when you use a direct quote, is when the original language must be or should be preserved. So, and fundamentally, that's it. That is the only circumstances when you should use a direct quote. When you need to preserve the original language. And you have to know that when your instructor is reading an essay or a piece of writing that you've done, and they see a direct quote, all instructors ask, why is this direct quote here rather than paraphrased, right? So the only valid answer to that question, why is there a direct quote here, is because it was necessary to preserve the original language. Okay? Now, there's basically two subcategories, could be more, but for the sake of brevity, we'll reduce it to two subcategories of preserving original language. The first subcategory is when the original language is so powerful, creative, or unique that to present it in any other way would not do it justice. And I'm going to give you two examples. There's a famous poem by Pablo Neruda, a Chilean poet. It's about the Spanish Civil War. It's called I'm Explaining a Few Things. And I'll paraphrase it, I don't have it in front of me, but basically he says, he's talking about the Spanish Civil War and the bombing of civilians. And he says that the blood of the children ran in the streets without fuss like children's blood, something like that. So the point that Neruda is making there when he says the blood of the children ran in the streets like children's blood is you cannot use any other analogy to accurately describe the horror of children's blood running through the streets, right? There's only one way to describe it. You can't say the blood of the children ran through the streets like, something else. Any other analogy you would use would be wrong or weakened or, unacceptable. So that construction that Neruda uses in that poem is a great way of saying, there are some things that you should not describe or, reduce, you have to preserve. There's only one way to describe it. And we see that, for example, as you know by now, my background is in history. we see this a lot in history when we're dealing with sources of people who are we have descriptions of the Holocaust or other things like that, and the language needs to be preserved because it's so powerful. A related example would be the current president of the United States, Donald Trump. He tweets, and most of his tweets you would want to actually quote directly to preserve the original language, which shows the intellectual capacity, the actual intellectual capacity of the United States president. So if, for example, you take the tweet where he was talking about, this is a while back, before he was president, that climate change was a hoax created by the Chinese to basically harm the U.S. economy, right? You want to preserve that original language. There's an anti-vax tweet that he did. So in that case, if you actually paraphrase one of Trump's tweets, you're improving it. It would be actually a strategy to make Trump appear something other than he is in that case. So you'd want to preserve the original language in those cases so you accurately show the intellectual capacity of the US president there. So those are kind of two examples of primary sources, right, where you would want to preserve the original language of a primary source. Now, secondary sources, in some cases, and again, secondary sources, we won't do a kind of a straight distinction here, but if you are engaged, let's say, in an academic disagreement or argument with someone, oftentimes academics will directly quote another scholar's crux argument. And you do that because there can be no mistake then that you are misrepresenting that person's argument, which is, as you see, kind of related to, the Trump. So if you're reading an academic and the academic is making a claim about the importance of, the nature of the terrain and the rain that fell the night before the Battle of Waterloo or something like that, right? And you're going to take exception or you want to disagree with that, but it's really important that you present the language of the actual argument there. Then that's perfectly acceptable to directly quote there. And again, certain disciplines as well will do this. So, for example, in law, you might want to quote the exact language of a case decision by a Supreme Court justice or something like that, where you could paraphrase it, but you want to actually preserve the exact language. And in that case, a case decision would be a primary source. But those are the kind of two categories. So it's sort of primary source original language that needs to be preserved, or if you're engaged in working with a scholarly conversation, and it is really important that you accurately represent sort of an argument as you outline it. How do you quote? Well, the most important thing, and the error we see the most with students when they're working with direct quotes, is they don't provide any context. Not only do not provide context in many cases, students often don't even introduce the quote. So as a rule, whenever you do directly quote something, you need to introduce it. So you need to say, Mackenzie argued, comma, quote, blah, 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 citation. So always introduce a quote and always try to provide context. And the context is what comes before the quote and what comes after the quote. So, if you're saying, we'll go back to the made up example of the rain the night before the Battle of Waterloo, which made the ground muddy, or not. So you could say, you're going to have a paragraph where you're talking about, the condition of the ground or the terrain is an often neglected element of military history or something like that. And then you want to say, yet, one person, Mackenzie, argues that it's very important. Indeed, he states, quote, you can't understand Waterloo without understanding the mud from the rain, or something like that, end quote. Thus, at least one scholar is paying attention to this or something. So there's not only an introduction to the quote, but there's a context of the quote, okay? And always provide a citation. How much quoting? So this is another question we get from students. How much quoting is too much quoting? And I don't mean to be passive aggressive here, but there's no hard and fast answer. And if a lecturer were to kind of put a limit on direct quotes, it actually wouldn't stand up going forward, because to be perfectly honest, if you're writing longer papers, book chapters, things like that, then you can do very extensive direct quotes, significant direct quotes. And again, to be perfectly honest, we go back to the rule about, when do you direct quote? If you have a original language that needs to be preserved and it's a significant chunk, then, there's an argument that the entire thing needs to be presented. So there's no hard and fast rule about that. However, I would say there's a bit of common sense. And in the case of a short essay, when the instructor encounters a direct quote, and again, remember, they're always going to ask that question, why is there a direct quote here, right? Rather than a paraphrase. Big quotes are going to probably have a kind of a tougher time answering that question, right? So there's no rule of thumb about how much quoting, but the shorter the paper, the more demanding or clear-cut the necessity of the direct quote needs to be, okay? Now, some of your instructors may provide explicit guideline about that. But the last thing I'll say about this, and again, just to I'm not trying to dodge an answer here, is you can always ask your instructor. This is one of the important parts of the draft process, right? And why it's so important to do a draft and to get feedback at the draft stage. Because if there's too much direct quotes going on in the draft stage, your instructor can flag it. If the direct quotes you use do not pass the test of, necessarily preserving original language, then that can be addressed in the draft stage. So there's our direct quotes. Let's move on to paraphrase and summaries. So again, there's resources about paraphrase and summaries on the course page, so I won't dwell on this for too long, but I'll just emphasize that in my experience, students are expected to paraphrase a lot, and there's not a lot of acknowledgement oftentimes from instructors about how difficult paraphrasing is. It's extremely difficult. And it's difficult because paraphrasing requires actually a very in-depth understanding of the source that you are paraphrasing. It is very difficult to have a surface level of understanding of a reading and to do a good paraphrase, okay? And again, I'm not going, what is paraphrasing, this is addressed in another video, but the point here I'm making is that it actually is very difficult to paraphrase well because it requires a very strong understanding of the source you're paraphrasing, okay? When do you use paraphrase? So and if we're kind of striking a distinction between what is a paraphrase and what's a summary, paraphrase in length is roughly often, would be about the same size or a little bit shorter than the actual text, whereas summary is a lot shorter. When do you use paraphrase? And the brief answer here is to simplify in most cases. So paraphrasing is extremely good at taking technical, complex passages and presenting them in more accessible language. And that's why you can see it requires a very strong understanding of the source. So if you have a passage that talks about some kind of complicated statistical finding, you have a sentence that talks about a complicated statistical finding, and you're writing for a target audience that is not going to probably have strong statistical skills, you want to paraphrase that sentence or two into more accessible language. Okay? The other time you can use paraphrasing is when it helps with the flow of paragraphs and the flow of arguments, right? But that would be less common use than the more common use would be, you are simplifying language. Okay, 9 times out of 10, that's when I'm going to use paraphrasing. Okay, summary. Well, summary is different from paraphrasing because, and again, there's not like necessarily a very hard distinction here. Sort of kind of porous. But generally speaking, when academics talk about the difference between summary and paraphrase, by summary, you're taking an entire book and telling the reader what it says or what the key argument is in a short paragraph, or a journal article in a short paragraph. All right. And that's what you're doing with a summary. Now, summaries you often use a lot in literature reviews or introductions, things like that, where you want to where you're placing your own research, so you give a brief overview of other research in the field. Okay. So again, when do you use summaries? As I said, most of the time you use summaries where you're kind of doing an overview of research. Paraphrasing, you'll use those when you want to simplify language, or you're kind of just making a claim that relies on this passage. And that's kind of reminds me, the other point is you can actually use sources without direct quotes, without paraphrasing, and without summarizing, and just with a citation. So if you read a book and it's about the Battle of Waterloo, and you kind of just read, and you're reading along, and it says the ground was muddy, and so Napoleon's cannonballs plopped into the ground rather than bounced along the ground, and you just want to say the ground was muddy. I mean, you're not really summarizing, you're not paraphrasing, but you're getting the information from somebody else, so it needs a citation. Okay. They say, I say. So this is basically a way of engaging in scholarly conversation. So what Swale says is the CARS model, or creating a research space. And again, you have plenty of resources for this on the course page. The point I want to emphasize here is that these are very practical ways and strategies for you as a student to work with sources, right? So how, as a junior scholar, do you take this journal article or this book that you're working with, and how do you actually engage with that reading, that author in your writing? And the whole area around they say, I say, cars provides these strategies to engage or enter into the scholarly conversation. And in particular, the cars model that create a research space is exceptionally good, strong, practical advice. And I mean, I'll just give a very brief example. Let's say you're doing a very short essay and you're struggling about how you're supposed to create a research space in a couple weeks in a very short essay. Well, let's say, for example, your topic is something about alcohol abuse or substance alcohol abuse, let's say, at third level, or drinking at third level. And you get a reading on American university students, and it talks about the extent of binge drinking and things that go along with that. And then you get a different reading, and it's about Irish third level, and it talks about binge drinking at Irish third level. And you notice in reading those two articles, there's big difference between the American university students and the Irish university students. And you actually say, I wonder, is it because the drinking age in the United States is 21 and the drinking age in Ireland is 18? That's enough for you to create a research space, right? So this is, the other video lecture, Research as an Inquiry, I talk about, kind of the importance of synthetic or synthesis. And that's a great example of how even as a first year student, you can engage in proper academic reading, writing, and synthesis of research that is a valuable contribution, right? So, even in this short paper, you could say, well, here's an article that talks about drinking and it's the conclusions for the United States students. And here's a different article, and this scholar talks about the conclusions for third level. And to create that research space, you are inserting yourself sort of between those two perspectives and bringing them together. As I said, maybe it's drinking age that makes the difference. So that the they say, I say, and the CARS model all provide great practical strategies on how students can enter the scholarly conversation. So really are very good tips. Okay, I said that I would keep this short. I think it is. So to conclude, what we're talking about when we're dealing with quoting, paraphrasing, summarizing, and they say, I say, is we're talking about you working with sources. And that's fundamentally, right, what we want to see happen in your academic writing. We want to see you engaging at a serious level with academic sources, right? So that's really important. Practice. So particularly with paraphrasing, as I said, that is not hard, and it requires a decent understanding of sources that you're working with, and even sort of getting it right takes a lot of practice. Writing is a skill, and like any other skill, it atrophies if it's not used, and it requires improvement, daily attention, right? And the final point I'll make, and this was made to me when I was a student, and it's probably some of the best advice I ever received as a student: model good writing. So, spoiler alert, a lot of the readings that you're going to do at third level would not be considered stellar examples of writing. In fact, you could even go a step further and say that some of the reading that you're going to do written by academics is actually poorly written, okay? Now, you're actually going to read some stuff that is extraordinary. And by the way, this is part of the intellectual challenge of third level is, you're going to read some stuff that's poorly written, but guess what? It's really important. The contribution it made to the field was monumental, so it's poorly written, but you have to read it. But you will read some stuff that is important and excellent, right? In terms of its prose, its structure. When you find that you're reading academic sources, books or a journal article, and you find that this is really good writing, you need to model that writing. So, if you look at how this academic author that you're reading, how are they using direct quotes, right? How are they setting up the direct quote? How do they move on from a direct quote? How are they organizing paragraphs, for that matter, right? The whole shebang. When you find good examples of academic writing, pay attention to it as a piece of writing and the kind of strategies and things that the author does, and model that in your own academic writing. Okay, so that was a brief lecture. As I said, it's meant to supplement the other resources that are on the course page in terms of paraphrasing. So I can get back to my Zugzwang now.